Welcome to CapitolView, where we discuss the latest in state government and politics. I'm Hannah Meisel with NPR Illinois. Joining us this week is Charlie Wheeler, Director Emeritus of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at the University of Illinois Springfield. Welcome, Charlie.
Thank you, Hannah.
And also here is Dan Petrella, State Government Reporter for the Chicago Tribune. Thanks for being here, Dan.
Hey, Hannah, good to be here.
Well, guys, I really can't believe I'm saying this, but on Wednesday of this week, former House Speaker Mike Madigan was indicted. A lot of folks in the Springfield political orbit thought this day would never happen, but now it has. Dan, it's been 19 and a half months since Madigan was named Public Official A in a deferred prosecution agreement the feds entered into with electric utility Commonwealth Edison. And, reading the indictment, at least what's in the first 6 of the 22 counts in there is stuff we've already learned since then. Take us through what is new, what is old, what is this indictment all about?
Sure. Basically, it alleges that Madigan, over the course of a decade or so, due largely to the breadth of the investigation, statute of limitations, things like that, operated his political and government organizations as a criminal enterprise for his own personal gain. There were allegations that ComEd was writing checks to associates for doing little or no work. Some of that's been out there, like you said, since the deferred prosecution agreement in the summer of 2020, that they were placing interns from the 13th Ward in the city of Chicago, which is Madigan's base of power on the southwest side, giving them internships without having them go through the regular channels, waiving grade point average requirements, things like that other people who were competing for those internships had to do. And then there's also some things related to a land deal here in Chicago that was never consummated, but there was a piece of state-owned property in Chinatown, and there was a developer that Alderman Danny Solis brought to Madigan. They wanted the state to transfer the property to the city so that the city could then sell it to this developer. And the payoff for Madigan was that the developer would use his property tax appeals law firm to assist with that effort. That never ended up going through, but there was lots of communication back and forth between Madigan and Michael McLean, who is sort of his top fixer, at least according to these allegations from the feds. Just a very wide-ranging kind of enterprise, and basically it all goes back to rewarding political allies of Mike Madigan and bringing business to his property tax appeals firm.
Alderman Danny Solis, like you mentioned, he is key to not just this investigation, but he's unlocked a lot of things for the feds because he has been cooperating with the feds for a number of years now, been wearing a wire, has numerous recorded conversations with Madigan and a lot of other very important folks. What's interesting about this deferred prosecution agreement is, a lot of the things, like you said, that we've known now for almost 2 years since the ComEd's deferred prosecution agreement was dropped in the summer of 2020. It's repackaged in a way that fits into this narrative of the quote unquote Madigan enterprise, fits into these racketeering charges that Madigan and Mike McLean, his longtime confidant, former ComEd lobbyist and friend, are up against. But, everything that had to do with Danny Solis, we had known a little bit about it, but this breaks a lot of things, wide open that we weren't put together before. So, Charlie, the feds allege that Danny Solis, said that he would bring Madigan's property tax appeals focused law firm, a bunch of business. He did this in a couple of ways, and there's a couple quid pro quo things that were alleged. Like Dan mentioned, there was this parcel of land. Legislature was set to pass a legislation to transfer that land to the city to then sell to this developer. But also, Danny Solis wanted to be, at least he said, we don't know if this was just a performance for, putting on the show because he's wearing a wire, but he said, hey, I want to be appointed to a state board, a state board that pays preferably over $100,000 a year. And, in exchange, there's a lot of stuff going on in my ward, and I'll bring you that property tax business. Charlie, first of all, did we expect this? Did you ever see this day coming? But also, talk about this is maybe a more straightforward kind of crime that the feds are alleging versus everything that we've known about ComEd before this. That's kind of, some people might say, well, that's just how politics work.
Yeah, and it occurs to me the allegations involving the property tax business from a legal standpoint, they strike me as being more easy to understand and more difficult to defend against, particularly if you have a tape, as Attorney John Lausch put it, with the very words. And here's a quote from him. He says, "The core of our evidence in this case, it's the words that are spoken by people. It's the things that show up on documents and emails." And so that is, in my mind, a more problematic situation because what would you say, the initial headline grabbing stuff was all this ComEd stuff. And Madigan's response has been, basically, I was doing what I was supposed to do as an elected official. I was trying to help out my constituents. I was trying to get people jobs. I was giving them recommendations, and I didn't do anything wrong. And I'm thinking, for someone who grew up in the Chicago Democratic or Cook County Democratic organization, that was the way things were done. And people of an older generation in Chicago might say to themselves, well, yeah, that's kind of how things worked. As a matter of fact, that's how things worked in DuPage County. That's how things worked in Sangamon County with Republicans. That was kind of the name of the game back in the day. Well, times have changed. And what the U.S. Attorney is suggesting is that Madigan did not change. He continued to use his position to help his friends, basically to bolster his political organization. And so, as I say, that is going to be a more difficult charge to prove, I think, than one that says, hey, if you steer business to me, I'll do a favor for you. That quid pro quo, to use that expression. And that's something that people are familiar with because there have been a lot of other public officials in Chicago who've gone down for that very kind of thing, not for giving jobs to their friends or working to leverage their influence to get somebody an internship somewhere, but because they line their pockets through their official activities. And in the case of Madigan, there's no suggestion that he personally took bribes from ComEd and pocketed them. Where the danger in terms of bribery lies, in my opinion, is the feds are saying he would take official action as Speaker of the House or as a ward committeeman in return for property tax business being steered to his firm. And because for much of this time, the Cook County assessor was an ally of his, Joe Barrios, the expectation was that if Madigan came in and said, oh, here's my client and you've got his property assessed for $5 million, and really it should only be a couple $100,000, that he get a kind of break like that. And as I say, I believe people can understand that easier than some of this convoluted political stuff. And, to answer your original question, no, I did not expect that this would happen. And part of it is, I thought that if they had the goods on Madigan, so to speak, or if John Lausch thought he had them, he would have announced it long ago. And I guess I underestimated the tenacity of John Lausch and the thoroughness of John Lausch and the fact that he would keep this grand jury going for, more than 2 years before finally returning the true bill and the indictments.
Well, I mean, there's a lot there. I mean, first of all, John Lausch if we rewind a year ago, his job was in danger. A new president comes in, John Lausch, as a Trump appointee. His job wasn't guaranteed, and a lot of other U.S. attorneys were being asked for their letters of resignation, and it wasn't until Senators Tammy Duckworth and Dick Durbin stepped in and said, hey, Biden Justice Department, John Lausch is clearly in the middle of an important investigation. Please, allow him to at least to finish. And we don't know how long that's going to take. John Lausch said on Wednesday afternoon at his very rare press conference that, the investigation was ongoing. That is kind of a thing that is said, but I think that there is probably going to be more, and we don't know how much more. But Dan, I'm glad that Charlie.
But it occurs to me that where can the more go, in the sense that he's already nailed the most prominent target. It's like saying, well, I just ran 27 marathons, and I'm going to go out and do a 5K around the neighborhood.
That's a good point. I think a lot of people kind of thought that, even if John Lausch never did indict Madigan, that he had still accomplished what he kind of set out to, because Madigan's been out of power. We all watched him fail to get a historic 19th term as House Speaker, and then, resign from his position as, just a mere state rep from the 22nd district that he's held for 50 years, and then resign as the chair of the Democratic Party of Illinois. But he still does hold other positions. Dan, he is still a state central committeeman in the state's Democratic structure, and of course, the longest served thing that he's held is being a 13th Ward Democratic committeeman within the Cook County Democratic Organization. Robin Kelly as new chair of DPI and the Cook County Democratic Party both asked for Madigan to step down from those positions yesterday. Tell us a little bit more about reaction. Obviously some of it's predictable. Republicans who have been using the, Madigan is corrupt angle for years now to varying degrees of success, they couldn't be more jazzed. Honestly, we saw a lot of rejoicing, and I think even from the Illinois Policy Institute, that the libertarian-leaning think tank, their email subject line yesterday evening was "Told you so."
Yeah, I think it was interesting that the news came out while Pritzker, the governor, and Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot were together at the University of Illinois at Chicago with Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, talking up the Biden economic agenda, and in the Q&A with Secretary Yellen answering questions about sanctions on Ukraine, sanctions on Russia for its incursion into Ukraine. And then we pivot to the governor and the mayor having to answer questions about this forthcoming indictment, which at that point they hadn't seen. Nobody had seen the paper yet. But one of the things that struck me was a comment that Mayor Lori Lightfoot, a former federal prosecutor and colleague of John Lausch, made, was essentially, as a prosecutor, if you're going to take this shot, you want to make sure you're going to hit your target. So I think, to Charlie's point, it shows that Lausch is very careful and meticulous in all his investigators in building this case. There may be other shoes to drop. There's been some reporting recently about similar activity at a subsidiary of AT&T, which we did not see in the indictment yesterday. So that's one potential avenue that hasn't been explored yet. And also, I think one thing that's interesting is that it really seems, from my colleague Jason Meisner's reporting, that this indictment is also trying to put the squeeze on Michael McLean, who is facing separate charges related to the ComEd case. And they're really trying to get him to flip on Madigan. He issued kind of a defiant statement about that yesterday. Another interesting thing that came out is that Governor Pritzker last month, really within probably the last couple of weeks, sat down virtually with federal investigators for about an hour from his home. He says answered all their questions, and Lausch said at his news conference that Pritzker is not a target of anything. They were talking to him as a witness, but just about his relationship with Madigan. Like you said, the Republicans celebrating somberly, I guess is how I would characterize their reaction yesterday. They point to a special investigating committee in the House back in 2020 that was led by current House Speaker Chris Welch, which kind of was very rancorous in a very partisan way and disbanded without really, talking to many witnesses. The Democrats on the committee blocked subpoenas. They were supposed to be investigating whether Madigan had conducted conduct unbecoming of a lawmaker, but sort of reached a deadlock on that. I think in an election year, this is not something that Democrats are eager to see. I think it's going to be another weight hanging around their neck. But like Republicans have been beating up on Madigan for a long time, so will be interesting to see how much more that moves the needle now that this is out there and is actual criminal charges.
Sure. Yeah. And, I want to talk about Mike McLean for a bit. He is a constant presence in all of this. He, the indictment says in a couple places that Mike McLean, he served to be a go-between. He served to shield Madigan from having to, have direct contact with these third parties. Except for in one interesting area of the indictment, someone who was getting, getting basically a paycheck for a do-nothing job with ComEd. They approached Madigan at some point, I think in 2019, and said basically they were concerned that they weren't doing anything from ComEd, and Madigan allegedly said, not to worry. You're doing exactly what you're meant to do. What matters to us is that you're doing the political work. This is just the arrangement. But Mike McLean, this is a pattern with Madigan. If we roll back a few, almost 4 years ago now, when Mike Madigan had to oust his, chief of staff, all-around right-hand man, also served as House clerk and executive director of the Democratic Party of Illinois, Tim Mapes. That was someone who shielded Madigan from, knowing what was going on, within a couple of places, but especially within the legislative structure. And, there was allegations of harassment that also came, a few months after allegations of harassment from Alina Hampton on the political side. And, Mapes had to be fired. But with every person close to Madigan that, he had to distance himself from, that he became more and more vulnerable himself. Right, Charlie?
In a way, the Times caught up with Madigan in that the stuff that's the bulk of this indictment from the U.S. attorney about his criminal enterprise, the bulk of it dealt with what used to be common politics in Chicago and in Illinois, where you hire your friends. You have precinct workers whose job is to deliver the vote. They're on somebody's payroll. They get a check. They don't expect them to show up. And it was in both parties. Now, there was a decision, the Rutan decision, that forbade hiring or promotion based on political affiliation. That came down against Governor Thompson because he had a great patronage operation. And so Madigan's people didn't adjust to that. And when you think about it, it wasn't all Ken Griffin's money. It wasn't Jim Durkin's outrage that got Madigan booted out as speaker. It was the courage of 19 rank and file Democrats who stood up and said, we will not vote you in as speaker again. And they could not be persuaded. They could not be cajoled. They could not be threatened. And as a result, Madigan saw the handwriting on the wall. And he withdrew he froze his candidacy to see what would happen. And the people, the 19, were adamant. And Chris Welch became the speaker a little more than a year ago.
Yeah. And, it's so interesting. We see Democrats trying to move on, at least most of them. Obviously, there is a lot of, there's some folks who have nostalgia for, the way things were. Certainly, we're getting into election year, and it's going to be the first election year without Madigan, protecting Democrats, but, especially his House Democratic members. But, we see Democrats desperately trying to move on, but yet, they have to contend with all of these power structures that Madigan built over decades. And Dan, I mean, how long might it take for Democrats to, kind of make, restructure their party in a way that, they feel free of Madigan? How long? That could take a long time.
Well, I think it's going to be an interesting test this year, especially, I would assume that a lot of the ground level political workers who worked for the Madigan organization haven't left the party, or probably are still going to be working, on people's campaigns. Obviously, there's a new state party head, there's a new Speaker of the House, but it'll be interesting to see if they sort of are able to marshal their resources and everything in the same way with the same discipline. It'll be very fascinating to watch what their strategy is. I think, it's sort of been this anchor that they've tried to shed over the last few years. You even saw the Democrats starting to run as being opposed to Madigan, especially in the suburbs where they've picked up seats in the last few election cycles. But, does this tie them to him again now that this is going to be playing out in court? I think that's a big question. I think the Republicans are going to try very, very hard to hang that on every Democratic candidate up and down the ballot.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we saw that in 2020, and that was some of the reason that, you might say that Governor Pritzker's graduated income tax failed, and Supreme Court Justice Tom Kilbride became the first Illinois, Supreme Court justice to ever not win his retention race. But we will see where things go. Certainly interesting times in Illinois politics. Grateful to be part of it. On a final note, this will be my last episode as host of Capitol View. We'll be taking some time off as Illinois Lawmakers program returns to air next week through the end of spring legislative session. I'll be back when Capitol View returns, this time as a panelist. It's been an honor hosting. Thank you for letting me into your living rooms and for the kind emails. And thank you to the production crew at WSEC in Springfield and WSIU in Carbondale. I'd like to thank my guests, Charlie Wheeler, Dan Petrella. Till next time, thanks for watching CapitolView. I'm Hannah Meisel. We'll catch you again next time.